Welcome to another episode of the Staying Free podcast. In this episode, I talk with Yuri Bezmenov's Ghost, who, if you're on Twitter and you're part of the kind of freedom community, then you're probably going to know who this is. He goes by a pseudonym, so I had no idea what to expect before talking to him. But we just had a wide-ranging, open conversation. As with a lot of my conversations, I don't really script this. We just kind of go into it and see where the conversation takes us. But Yuri was a great guest and brought a lot of perspective and also a kind of stoic approach to some of the topics that we were discussing, which is always great. So I hope you enjoy the episode. If you do, and you want to give it a share on Twitter, that would be hugely appreciated. And if you're enjoying the podcast, then please give it a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're using. All right, on to the episode.
I'm in an interesting position because I sort of effectively work for the government.
Oh, okay.
So I work for a government department, and I suppose the whole area for me that is just kind of as to coin a phrase, triggered me since the first lockdown on the 23rd of March 2020 is that I've just never accepted that any government should have the authority to institute the sort of restrictions and controls that they did without, frankly, people rioting in the streets. That's kind of my take on it, is that like the whole premise of lockdowns and, social distancing and all that crap, frankly, I just don't accept it as legitimate, almost in any circumstances, actually. And it's been quite interesting for me. It's been quite an interesting journey because I've spent the last couple of years, and I'm quite open about it in work. I don't hide it. From day one, I've said, well, this is all bollocks, frankly. And I've managed to kind of, steer a path of not getting fired, which has been quite interesting. Okay. I interact a lot with local authorities and local government. And, I suppose my particular concern is I think we need root and branch reform of democracy in its entirety in this country. The entire institutions of local government and central government have just become monsters, frankly. They're out of control. And sort of what I don't have is a design of what it should look like, to kind of bring some sort of semblance of like accountability back into public life. But I do think that it's entirely necessary. So
let's start there then. So is that an opinion you've always held, or is that something which it is only off the back of everything that happened in 2020?
No, I think I've definitely not always held it. I think, I'm in my 50s. So, I've lived through, a multitude of governments and sort of changes in government. And I'm old enough to remember sort of local district councils when I was probably a kid and sort of a teenager, where they seemed quite useful. They used to get stuff done, and you could have positive interactions. And certainly I think I grew up in sort of council housing and a council estate, and the council as it was then, it wasn't a social landlord. You were dealing directly with the council, and by and large, actually, they provided a pretty good service. They concentrated on all the basics and didn't get wrapped up in a multitude of, political agendas, which is what they now do. Every single, contemporary agenda that comes along, they create a task force and allocate resources to it. Meanwhile, people are really interested in like getting the bins emptied and fixing the potholes in the roads and stuff like that. And the big one now, is farcical, really, in my mind, is that pretty much every local council now in the UK has declared a climate emergency.
Okay.
And I just kind of think like the ability of local authorities to have any significant impact on, the so-called climate emergency is just partial, really. They tinker at the edges and they'll do stuff like they'll put a few solar panels in and they'll try and reduce their sort of carbon emissions. And that's all laudable, but the idea that, they're going to do that to an extent where you'll mitigate, all the carbon outputs by 2030 is just a fantasy, really. And but you're not allowed to say that. Nobody will stand up and say, this is nuts. and don't get me wrong, I'm an environmentalist. I'm absolutely on board with, reducing emissions. Particularly, my thing is like, we need to focus a lot less on carbon and a lot more on environmental damage.
Yeah.
There's lots of things we could do, practical things that would make an enormous impact to the environment, much more than worrying about a few fractions of a percentage in carbon. But those quite often are slightly, they're sort of harder and more tangible things. So actually, if you chase after these sort of like mythical, almost impossible targets, as long as you're looking like you're doing the right thing, everyone kind of, feels quite good about it. And, and the amount of resources that's going to get in the next 10 years, the amount of resource that will get diverted into, following these agendas is going to be absolutely horrific. And most of it will have almost zero impact.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about the environmental stuff as well is that most of the solutions, which are actually you can do on an individual level, are not really promoted that much. And the ones that are promoted as the things we need to do, it's all, okay, well, a government needs to do it. A government needs to have a carbon target. We need to tax this and tax that. Whereas actually just everyday things that people could be doing. I mean, one of the things that I think would be really important is, if we're concerned about emissions, like we should have kind of be teaching in schools maybe, or have kind of government campaigns to get people to like grow their own food in their garden or something like this, to stop all of that transportation, grow locally, eat stuff that's in season. But these things ultimately, they don't require a tax, they don't require big government, so they're just kind of sidelined, they're never talked about. And it seems quite evident to me as well that governments, they don't really put much effort into anything that will enable the individual to become more self-sovereign. Things like growing your own food. It's like, we can't talk about
Absolutely.
that because they will lose dependent on these big centralized institutions.
Yeah, no, totally, I agree with that. It's it's quite an interesting being my age, because I sort of have lived through the pre-internet era, and it seems bizarre really, because I still consider myself reasonably young in that sense. But when I grew up, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have smartphones, and takeaway food almost didn't exist. The nearest we had, I think, to takeaway food was a Wimpy bar growing up, and in terms of consumption, even things like I'm a coffee addict, and I drink far too much of the stuff, and consume enormous amounts of resource on an individual basis with my coffee habit. That actually 30 years ago, I would have just been having cups of tea at home, or having a coffee out of a flask or something.
Yeah, and this goes back to what you were saying before as well, when you were talking about how things used to be much more kind of localized. And I guess like I know this just from kind of talking to my grandparents and reading about kind of foregone eras, like probably like not maybe the boomer generation, but probably the generation above that would have been probably the one which I would allude to as being most evident of this, which is it was all about individual responsibility and doing things on a local level. And even just little things like if there was a problem, if a petty crime had been committed, for instance, most of the time it was just dealt with by a neighbor. It was dealt with by someone around the corner who would just say, hey, your son's done this, your daughter's done this, or whatever. Exactly. And they get a slap on their wrist. And even if they were going to involve like the local bobby or whatever, it would have to be a pretty significant crime. There's someone that I know who like actually broke into someone's house, and they didn't even call the police. It was just like, hey, this person's been thieving. Just give them a slap on the wrist. And it was all dealt with within the community. It wasn't like the police were not involved. And this just seems to be, I don't know, just nowadays it's very different. Nowadays it's like everything involves the police. I mean, this became really evident to me during the whole kind of Corona debacle, which is if people were having like a party, for instance, in their house, you'd have the next door neighbor like calling the police, telling them. I mean, if you really that concerned about it, just go around and knock on the door and say, hey, do you mind cutting it out?
Yeah, and actually, if you're polite, if you do that in the right way, you'll probably get a reasonable response as well.
Yeah, totally. You'll get a reasonable response, yeah. And now everything is just trending towards pushing responsibility, whether it's the climate, whether it's policing, whether it's education, whatever it is, it's just pushing it all towards these centralized authorities. Like everyone has to act under this one rule, which is coming from this one entity.
Yeah, and the way I've seen it, it's sort of over my sort of life, even in my lifetime, is that increasingly almost everything is to an extent being subcontracted to the state. So the individual is the majority of the population willingly subcontract all of this stuff to the state, rather than taking responsibility at a personal level. So I've had it as a, for instance, like there were some local kids a few weeks ago. I was in my local area and some young kids, I don't know, 10, 11 years old or something like that, just dropped a load of litter on the floor.
Right.
Like been to the chip shop and just dropped their bag. And I just said, hey, excuse me, you're going to pick that up. And I don't worry about having these sorts of conversations because, I actually see it as a duty of a responsible citizen to sort of, challenge behaviour like that. And I don't particularly like the phrase, but I think it was Hillary Clinton, wasn't it, that used the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. And
oh yeah, I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, there was and that's true.
Good. That's good.
It's true to an extent. I can remember like growing up, the one thing I used to, we used to get up to mischief like most kids do. And our big thing was always like, we used to light little fires. I think we were a bunch of, pyromaniacs on the quiet. Never dangerous, but we just like little campfires in sort of little bits of woodland and stuff like that. And but it always used to make me chuckle because you'd always stop if you saw an adult come in. You could say, "Well, look, here comes a grown-up," and we'd actually kick it over and put it out, sort of thing, because we saw all grown-ups as being part of that sort of level of authority that would, if necessary, take you home to your parents and get you into more trouble when you got confronted by your parents.
Yeah.
Whereas even that now would be, say if somebody, saw some kids doing that, they either just walk past it and ignore it, and they'll tut loudly, or they'll literally, as you say, they'll ring the police and just subcontract it to, to the sort of state effectively. And I've seen it in big area. I've seen that happen is in the charity sector where, so much. I mean, I've been involved in a few charities over the years, and that used to be all very much done on a local level. Mm-hmm. And what you find now is you get these big charities who, look to sort of, they're quite territorial. They want to dominate their particular area. And therefore, they spend half their life fundraising, and people are happier to give money to charities than they are to actually get off their arse and do something themselves. And so it's this strange kind of, I suppose it's an indication, or it's a reflection of sort of, development, in that people have become much wealthier in general, probably a lot busier as well, because people are flogging their guts out at work, and therefore, they just want to do their own thing in their sort of spare time rather than, being an active citizen, as I call it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and this is the thing, like people wonder why the scope of government has increased so much, or why, everything costs so much and you have to pay so much taxes and stuff. And this kind of gets to the root of it. It's because we have, as you said, like we've subcontracted so much to the government. We've just said, whatever it is, the government will do it, whether that's, okay, I'm not going to confront this person for doing something. I'm going to tell the police, and like you said, even with charity and things, it's like people are always talking about charity, and that's great if you give to charity, but also there are charitable acts that you can do in your own community that cost nothing except for your time, right? But it's almost like people just say, well, that can be someone else's job, but then at the same time we'll complain about it. And, quite often I find it's the same people who are complaining, who are saying, all the rich people should, people who earn over this much money, etc., they should pay really high taxes and things because there's poverty. And it's like, well, start at home, start where you are, and say, like, what are the things that you can be doing? If there is poverty around the corner, what are the things that you can do to help that person, right? And if everyone kind of thinks like this more and thinks more on a local level, which I think obviously having local governance will help that, because it will kind of be a catalyst for this kind of social change, then you everything will come down in price a bit, because you don't have to have the same level of taxes, because the government isn't responsible for everything. I mean, I think in the UK now, the government, the actual public sector is more than 50% of the economy. I think that it breached that critical threshold maybe in the past couple of years, where public sector spending was more than half the economy.
Yeah, I can easily believe that.
Yeah, which is absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, if you'd have said this to someone living, probably only 50 or 60 years ago, I don't even think you'd have to go much further than that. It would have been absolutely outrageous to think.
No, I totally. And it's like, there's another great quote I remember seeing, or not so much a quote, but sort of articles and things about sort of America, sort of pre-1900. Places like Chicago was the one that springs to mind. The sort of looking at cities like Chicago, where you had roads and buildings and everything being built, and hospitals and stuff, and the state effectively didn't exist at that point.
Yeah.
It was just a very minor sort of part of daily life, and yet all these things, and even in the UK, actually, if you think about the UK, the railway network that is predominantly still what we use was all built by private sector funding. The canal network, the railway network, all that stuff, none of that was built with the state. That's all built with private enterprise. And, yet somewhere along the line, we've effectively transferred that sort of ownership for one thing, but also even, the development of those sorts of things now is almost entirely driven by the state.
Yeah.
And it might have a sort of, you have a kind of a front window. The railway industry is a good example where you have, train operating companies and network rail, but, effectively they're all state subsidized. And so they don't really run as, true private enterprise. So.
And this is something that I think has been very deliberate as well. I don't think it's an accident. And this is how I kind of break it down to people, especially people who are kind of on the left, who think that, big government is really great because it kind of acts as some kind of counterbalance to corporate power. Well, I actually think that it's completely the opposite. And I think that this is demonstrated by what we see in the world, which is that actually this is a deliberate ploy to get power to move over to government, because that actually gives the corporations one central entity to lobby. So if you actually have a big government, that gives the corporations, one kind of, or maybe it's the EU, or, maybe it's the American government, or maybe it's, whatever it is, but it's a government entity, which is much easier to lobby than to try and lobby, lots of individual people or lots of smaller communities, right? So it's not that the government acts as a counterbalance to corporate power when government gets bigger. That is a kind of it's a farcical, or what's the word? It seems logical, but actually when you see how things operate in the real world, those entities just get lobbied. And we've seen this with COVID, right? We've seen all of these governments get lobbied by Big Pharma to say, you have to mandate our product. Which is, that is kind of, if you read up on fascism and what fascism actually entails, a lot of the nature of fascism is actually about governments forcing, essentially working in tandem with corporations to force on the individual. The power of the corporation is kind of levied by the government, kind of. So this is kind of what we've seen, and this hasn't emerged without kind of deliberate thought, in my opinion. It's actually quite sinister. Governments and corporations both want a big centralized government entity with high regulation, etc., because then that they get their rules passed. These people with a lot of money, they go to one person, they say, we're going to steer society in the direction we want.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I've worked for big multinationals and sort of SMEs, so I've got a pretty good perspective on it, I think. And all big corporations effectively strive to become a monopoly. I mean, that's almost written in their DNA. They literally want to become a monopoly, so, they talk, a market share is the sort of acceptable version of that. But, every company in essence wants to achieve 100% market share, which is, if you talk about 100% market share, people go, oh, that's, I don't think people necessarily see that as being the same thing as an actual monopoly, but it obviously is. And any corporation, the shareholders, that's exactly what they want. So they'll do everything that they can to achieve that. And then they, as you say, then all they've got to do is negotiate with government in terms of, what regulation they have to comply with. And largely, when you're that big, you can steer the regulation anyway. So, when you're dealing with government ministers, I mean, and particularly some of the regulatory bodies, I mean, the corporations have all the knowledge and all the power, really. So the tail is very much wagging the dog in most of those instances. And you see that. I mean, that's been the big learning thing for me in the last 2 years with the whole COVID thing. And it's quite ironic, actually, because like up until 2019, I understood that pharmaceutical corporations were businesses, but I never realized quite how sort of, venal, I suppose, I'm not sure what the word is, but, just how utterly like morally bankrupt they are, relative to, I kind of always assumed they had a sort of an overriding purpose of, coming up with medicines and products to sort of, make people healthier. And the thing that I mean, it's quite ironic actually, because, having seen what's been going on, I've probably, done more research on, vaccines and the pharmaceutical industry in general in the last 12 months than in the previous 30 years. And like, I think now if somebody says to me, are you an anti-vaxxer? I'll probably say, well, I didn't used to be, but now I've done some research. I am, yes.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that a few times. Yeah, you're not the first person to tell me that. I mean, I actually think that this is one of the big, I don't necessarily want to say problems, because obviously like that would be claiming to, to know the truth about vaccines and this kind of thing. I'm someone who hasn't really changed my mind about previous vaccines. At least I haven't been kind of convinced of that. But I do think that like,
this section of the conversation has been censored in order to meet the community guidelines. For the full uncensored version of this conversation, please check the description for links to censorship-free platforms.
And maybe the answer is you shouldn't trust the others. I'm not obviously claiming that you definitely should. In my view, I still do at this point. But yeah, I mean, this is going to happen, and I honestly think that if they were to, I think that you're going to see now a decline in MMR and TB and all these other vaccines that people get, especially kids at school, etc. I think that we're going to see a marked decline from here, because it will have probably damaged, I guess, trust in vaccines for probably at least a generation. Whether or not that's the right thing to happen, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true in my case. I mean, that the last 2 years has shattered my trust in pretty much every single institution that I interact with, be it government, the health service, the police. I mean, I've had several, I would have been absolutely shoulder to shoulder with the police 2.5 years ago in terms of, sort of public order and supporting the police. And my position has completely changed on that now because of the things I've experienced in the last 2 years, at the sharp end. And I'm, here am I, a middle-aged professional family man who is now, certainly ambivalent and borderline actively, sort of, not supporting the police because of some of the things I've seen up close and personal, which is a pretty appalling place to get to, really.
Are you referring here to the protest by any chance?
Yeah, and some things I've seen locally as well. I've been involved in a few, not even protests, just kind of, gatherings and, seeing police like stopping, for example, old ladies from sitting on a park bench, and you think, God almighty, on what planet are these people thinking, Literally. So, and the fact that, and I think if you mix in amongst that, in the middle of all of this, we had the BLM sort of protests as well, where, there was sort of evidence of clear two-tier policing going through that. And, so, and the thing that has really shocked me is the willingness of the sort of the police to just follow what are clearly, nonsensical kind of restrictions in some cases. And I would have expected more police, certainly some of the sort of, maybe not the senior, but the mid-ranking officers to come out from time to say, actually, this is bollocks. We can't be doing this we have to distance ourselves from this as much as we are, sort of sworn to an oath to uphold the law. What we're being asked to do isn't actually in the spirit of the law. It might be in the letter, but it clearly isn't within the spirit of the law. Therefore, we should refuse to actually participate. And the fact that there's been none of that, there's been literally none of that, that even in the most ridiculous circumstances, where, like you say, somebody's got a couple of friends round and the police come and knock on their door because they're having a drink with their mate. It's just bonkers. I don't accept it. Fundamentally don't accept it. So.
No, I don't accept it either. But I also do think that the police, just like most people, because, you know, we're in a minority, you know, you and I, Yuri, like we actually don't believe this stuff. But the average person does believe it. And I think also the average police officer does. And if anything, I would possibly say that probably more police officers than even average people believe this stuff. So they believe that they're doing it for the greater good, right? And that doesn't mean that it's obviously right. I mean, I completely agree with you. But I'm not sure that it's that people actually have a moral objection to it, police officers, and that they're just not acting on that. I actually think that they don't morally object to it because they have bought the whole, you know, they bought the whole narrative, hook, line and sinker.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's true. And, you know, if you have accepted that, you know, all of these restrictions have a, you know, well, first and foremost, I guess if you accept that there's this deadly virus that, and this again, this is I think where if you're a sovereign individual, you don't buy this stuff because you will always take the view that it's my choice. You know, if I choose to expose myself to risk, that's on me. Yeah. Whereas there's this kind of collective mindset, which is that, you know, people have to be looked after because they'll make bad decisions otherwise, and therefore we have to enforce these draconian restrictions. Otherwise, people will make the wrong choices. Well, you know, in my world, or in my mind, you know, you're perfectly entitled to make bad choices. You know, I get that. You know, if that starts to impact on other people, that's a problem. And you know, so you know, there are, you know. If I, you know, meet with some friends who are all consenting adults that have decided to come and, you know, spend some time together but I mean, it was bizarre actually. I mean, I was going to meetings, you know, during the lockdown, and it was literally like we were like the French Resistance, you know, going in the back door of darkened houses, and we were just laughing about it. We're saying like, what the fuck? This is like, you know, this is not 1940s France, occupied France. This is bloody sort of sleepy Gloucestershire, you know, in the middle of like what's supposed to be a civilized democracy. What is going on?
Yeah,
and you're right though, because the weirdest thing is there would have been plenty of people, and you know, without doubt, the majority would have quite happily seen us arrested for the mere act of gathering, you know, illicitly as it supposedly was at the time.
I've kind of mentioned this in a couple of my previous conversations, but I don't know whether you feel the same here, but, you know, whenever I looked back at history and I wondered, you know, how did kind of Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia or whatever, how did it get to that point? How did it get so bad? You know, Maoist China, some of the, you know, these periods of history that we hear about. And that question was answered for me in 2020. I was just like, okay, now I see it. You know, it like I was just like, oh, it's just propaganda, and which is exactly the story we were told, right? Like when you read about these things, it's like, well, yeah, everyone's really propagandized, and you're like, really, but how? You know, like how? And then 2020 came along, and I was like, that's how.
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it? I will never ever, I don't think, understand. You know, because I mean, the advantage I've got, I suppose, my background is sort of engineering, and I've spent a lot of time handling, you know, big volumes of data and analysing data, you know, statistical data and stuff like that. So I'm pretty good at stats and, you know, doing analysis and stuff like that. Very early on, I was looking at some of the stats and the graphs that they were showing, and I'm screaming at the telly, basically saying, well, that's complete bollocks. Yeah. You know, they're it was very obvious early on they were misrepresenting data, and I'd still like to know why that was. And I think as much as I try not to be, you know, go down the conspiracy theory sort of rabbit hole, you have to ask that question: why were they so blatantly misrepresenting data? You know, so what was the agenda? Because there clearly was an agenda.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what makes it impossible not to go down that rabbit hole, though, right? Because when you know, once you've got a smoking gun, it's natural to just say, okay, well, you know, what's the reason behind this? And obviously various people have different reasons. But the only one that I can't get on board with is the idea that it's just a cock up, because it's like, you don't misrepresent. Like, a cock up is that maybe there's some things, you know, that go in one direction, maybe some things go in the other direction. But when categorically it's always on one side, that you always make it seem like we're in, you know, this deadliest pandemic, you know, arguably since whatever, there's the Spanish flu or whatever, but just that everyone's dying on the streets, and it just wasn't true, right? Like, you know, as I said, they misrepresented it always in one direction, and that is that's a massive red flag.
Yeah, and for me, that's the big unanswered question still, really. You know, the I don't know. I mean, the sort of, there's so many overlapping agendas. I think I'm at the point where I can believe that it's all about that. You know, there isn't this one. I mean, the World Economic Forum and all the heavily invested players in that clearly have huge influence, you know, on everything, on the banking system, on the economy, on international trade. So the idea that they're not involved in this in some respect is just naive in the extreme, really. And then you throw into the mix the sort of, you know, I mean, the great irony of politics really is that, you know, the people who would be best placed to run most things aren't interested in politics and therefore don't get involved in it. You know, the people that gravitate towards politics tend to be the people who, you know, want to control things and design the world in their own sort of image. And so, you know, it's not a surprise that you've got the sort of, you know, the statists gravitating to all these institutions to try and, you know, the idea of, you know, it's well documented that there are plenty of people, certainly in, you know, the last 150, 200 years, who had designs on sort of one world government and, you know, global socialism or Marxism or whatever you want to call it. And so, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise that there are people actively trying to make it happen. So, whether or not that was the driving force behind some of this stuff, I don't know. I'm on the fence on that one still.
Well, I mean, the people who are purveyors of big government, they love a crisis, don't they? I mean, because a crisis necessitates them. And kind of going back to what we were saying before, it's almost like everything when it comes to the world at the moment is, not at the moment, I guess this has kind of been historically true, but it's just been this trend, especially recently, where it's kind of gone into overdrive, which is to increase the necessity for government in every way. It's like, you know, people can't be, you know, obviously we're talking here about, you know, a pandemic and that, oh, well, we need a government response to this to save people's lives, whether it's global warming and we need a government response to keep carbon below X degrees, whatever, or even on the more local community level, as we were saying before, you know, like encouraging people to, you know, dob in their neighbors and stuff, rather than, you know, just go and have a conversation with them, you know, schooling, it's, you know, just whatever it is, it's all just try to channel everything towards the necessity for big government. And it's just going into kind of an exponential curve right now. And I don't know where the brakes are on this, because most people actually are on board with this. You know, they're on board with the idea that we've had this catastrophic pandemic, that the government have to take away, you know, everyone's freedoms and lock everyone in their homes and force vaccines on people. Or, you know, others believe that the only way that we are going to escape, you know, global climate meltdown is by having, you know, governments, you know, force all of these, you know, do carbon taxes and kind of force people to use kind of greener energy, etc. And it just seems to me that, I don't know where the brakes are on this thing, but it's kind of like so many people are in this ideology. And I do think a lot of people have maybe left it off the back of the COVID thing. I think a lot of people who maybe were really on board with kind of global governance have kind of been a bit red pill through this process. But I still think that the average person, especially in the West, you know, maybe this isn't true in the developing world, but in the West is kind of on board with all this stuff. You know, they might not outwardly say, I support the WEF and all of these kind of globalist institutions, but if you were to look at what they actually want to bring about, I think most people will probably support them. So you know, it's kind of worrying.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's one of the things I was interested to sort of just have a bit of a conversation about. Is like, you know, I think we can analyse to death how the hell we got here, but I'm more interested in like, what the bloody hell do we do now?
Yeah. So tell us what we do, Yuri.
Well, I was hoping you'd be able to help me with that. I think that's the bit that I find the sort of the terrifying thing. Really, is like when you think, how on earth do you actually unwind some of this stuff? And I think I think you just have to start with localism. I do think that. I think to an extent, but there's probably a limit. That will go so far. You can, do you still play that? I mean, I've sort of got quite heavily involved in the Freedom Alliance, and I've looked at all the sort of emerging sort of more libertarian sort of parties that are reclaim and reform, and it's an absolute bloody mess. Frankly, you've got all these kind of minority parties all fighting for the same small chunk of the electorate, and we're just all going to annihilate each other in the process. Is there even any point playing the political game? Is the sort of one of the questions. I mean, is it literally the only way? Is armed insurrection the only way out of this? And if that's the case, then we really are screwed, because that ain't going to go very far. So,
what is the Freedom Alliance?
It's a political party that was set up last year.
Oh, I've not heard of it.
Yeah, it's worth. They're obviously very new, but it's a genuine, unlike all of the other ones, it's a genuine grassroots party.
Okay.
It was literally started by half a dozen people that were just so utterly sick of what was going on and so horrified at what was going on. They were literally, driven to actually set up a party to try and do something about it. And I'll drop the link into their website into the chat. But
cool. Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, so they're pretty green, and they're sort of struggling to put together a manifesto. But I think they're already finding that you can't please everybody. It's a bit like, if you've ever seen any of the Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, it's the popular People's Front of Palestine versus the People's Popular Front of Palestine, and you've got all these small groups kind of jostling for position. But the one thing I will say is that, because I've been active in politics previously, and I've always been reasonably active in politics, sort of locally. Unlike most of the other ones, that they are a genuine grassroots membership-led party, and I mean the bit they're struggling with at the moment is establishing, the sort of structure and the governance in terms of how you grow from, just a very small sort of protest group into a potentially a political party that can fight elections.
Yeah,
and, that's a hell of a leap, frankly.
Do you think you'll run if the party really takes off?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I definitely will. The next elections where I live will be 2024. So my plan will be to stand as a candidate at that point. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Yeah. I mean, I guess that's what we need to see more of. Yeah,
because I'm very much of the view that even if I'm incredibly cynical about politics now, in that the big thing with politics is that you get a vote, but you don't get to select the candidates, and so you are basically given a very limited choice of candidates. And I think one of the things that I've found over the last few years is that I almost feel like, and this is a terribly cynical view, but I almost feel like almost every member of parliament to be a member of parliament is selected on their ability to be compromised, so that if they actually get elected, they get a quiet knock on the door from dark forces, or whatever you want to call it, and you look at the way they behave in parliament, compared to the promises they make, on the way in, and you think, what happened to these people? At some point, they've been so horrifically compromised in some way that they can almost be persuaded to do anything once they're in government. And so I don't know. So so I've just dropped the link in there, so you can have a look at that in the chat if you can see that. But
yeah, so I'm just looking at the description on the website of this Freedom Alliance website, and it says, We believe in protecting and preserving the absolute rights of people to leave home whenever they choose, make a living and operate business premises, freely associate, assemble, and peacefully protest, speak freely without censorship or penalty, make their own medical choices without coercion and penalties. This seems like just a laundry list of stuff that was just completely normal before 2020.
Yeah, I know, it's absolutely staggering, and they are probably considered, extreme. It's insane.
Yeah, no doubt we'll hear how extreme they are.
They've already been. I've seen some press where people have accused them of being anti-Semitic, of being right-wing, and it's utter nonsense. I mean, actually, it's an incredibly diverse, group. I went to a meeting a few weeks ago, and genuinely diverse, both ethnically and from a background and sort of political perspective point of view. So it's extraordinary, really. Yeah. So I do think there has to be, you've got to have a political kind of arm of whatever you do. I mean, if you're gonna try and create a new society, or at least a much better version of what we've got, you're going to have to go through the sort of political side of things. And I think, what we do need at the same time is a lot more local activism. But I'm incredibly pessimistic, frankly, because, the levels of apathy that you see, and I mean, it's quite funny. Obviously, sort of, my wife's a lot less active than I am, but she kind of, tolerates a lot of the things I get up to.
Yeah.
And she reminds me from time to time, I said 18 months ago, I think, in the first lockdown, I said, if they don't lift this lockdown in 2 weeks, there'll be riots in the streets, because that's kind of how I was feeling. And actually, literally 6 months later, there's nobody rioting in the streets, and, nobody even seems that fussed about it. And I'm like most people, I suspect I've fallen out with a number of, people that I considered friends, because they literally couldn't understand any of my objections to what was going on. It was bizarre, honestly. I mean, and I'd have conversations with friends when I'd say, do you want to come around for a beer or something? This would have been like, not necessarily in lockdown, but when we were under sort of some of the, restrictions about bubbles and all that crap. And I'd just invite them around and say, do you want to come around for a beer? And they say, well, no, we're not allowed. And I said, well, what do you mean you're not allowed? Yes, you are. Do it. If you want to come. I'm not saying you can't come. And it's like, and I just remember being staggered that, like, grown men would literally say that they weren't allowed because the government had told them not to. And I just... Yeah, it's almost like there's if you're willing to allow the government to say whether you can or cannot leave your house, and some of these really basic things, it's like what will you not do for your government? Is there anything that they can possibly ask of you that you won't do? Because this is the thing, like when you just blindly trust in authority, or you blindly just say, whatever they say, I'm going to do it because they're the government, and of course that must be the right thing to do. That's just such dangerous thinking. And I feel like we don't get tested on it that much. We don't get tested on it necessarily every day, but 2019 was a huge test of that, and I think that most people failed miserably. Yeah, absolutely. That's why I am quite pessimistic in some respects, and I'm an optimist, by nature. But even the whole things with the vaccine now, and you think, like, there's enough evidence now. I was looking at some slides today. Actually, somebody posted on Twitter showing if you're triple boosted or double jabbed and boosted. I mean, I don't know what the difference is between a booster and the first two. It's all the same, frankly. But there's almost universally.
This section of the conversation has been censored in order to meet the community guidelines. For the full uncensored version of this conversation, please check the description for links to censorship-free platforms.
Well, yeah. I mean, I saw an article the other day. I don't know who it was. It might have been the Telegraph or something. And they said, with COVID cases at record levels, we ask, why are people refusing the booster? And I was like, literally the first half of that headline explains the second half of the headline. You don't need an article about that.
Yeah. The interesting thing as well is that, like, actually, even the language is so lazy. Like, they haven't got COVID. They've tested positive for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So actually most of those people haven't developed COVID. The people who develop COVID are the ones who end up in hospital. And
and you will know about that through your personal experience. This is the thing. I mean, I just think that if you took the media away, and I think that most people really, they understand this. Maybe they've not said it explicitly, but I think most people, they sense this, that if the media had not have been pushing this thing, every single day and telling you, how afraid you should be and how many people are dying and how many people are in hospital, etc. Like, I just don't think that most people would know they were in a pandemic. And, there is a historical precedent for this, because we had like the Hong Kong flu, which was, when you adjust for kind of population and stuff, it was probably about as bad as what we've had with COVID. It might have even been slightly worse. I'm not saying that for sure, because I need to review the figures. The problem, by the way, just as an aside, is that with the COVID figures, rather than doing it per year, as we normally do for respiratory illnesses and say how many people died in a year, they've just kept the figures rolling for about 3 years now, whatever. Yeah. So it's completely impossible to actually ascertain, because it's another,
and that's when you come back to this issue of misrepresentation of data, don't you? In that, like, they are clearly misrepresenting data deliberately. So why is that happening? And,
exactly. But despite, even despite that, at that time during the Hong Kong flu pandemic, you had festivals going on. There was no international travel, that was disrupted, etc. Like, they basically just got on. So it's not like when we talk about what would happen if the media was not talking about this every day. It's not like some kind of just intellectual exercise. We have a historical precedent, and life basically went on as normal.
Yeah. And I think that's the bit, again, it's impossible not to sort of go down quite a dark rabbit hole. And I mean, I do believe there's a massive overlap with the, UN Agenda 2030, the whole zero carbon thing, because, the lockdowns were a great excuse for, if you look at what's happened to travel, the whole restrictive nature of travel. And, and I mean, I will say, ironically, it's not all been bad. I mean, the one positive has been the massive and rapid acceleration in, home working and sort of remote working.
I agree.
Pretty much everybody I know, most of the people I know tend to work in sort of, professional sort of capacities in sort of office based, and every single one of them, you won't, I think, other than the odd one or two that just misses the sort of the social content. But I would say upwards of 95% of the people I know, are enjoying the changes in terms of, not commuting, remote working. And even we were talking about it today in the office, at least 50% of the meetings now that we will choose to use Zoom or Teams rather than do it in person, because, if you need to go to a 1 hour meeting that's an hour's drive away, that's half your day wasted for the sake of, whereas, and actually, I would guess, for most people, they're working less hours in reality. They're producing the same output, but probably working 20% less hours. And you'll get lots of people who will deny that and say, no, I'm working more and I frankly don't believe it. I think they're just trying to make excuses, because most people will, because you're not traveling and you're not, I mean, it's noticeable when I'm in the office how much time you waste just chatting.
Well, the other aspect of this is that when so many people are working remote, I think that something that they hadn't, when I say they, I'm talking here about, the people who've really pushed this whole agenda. Something that I think they haven't factored into their calculations is how many people are able to move away now from their nation state. So I've met a lot of people out here in Mexico, and I'm one of them, who, because they're now working remotely and they have the option to leave, they've left countries that have had lockdowns and vax mandates and stuff. The amount of Canadians, for instance, who are just like, well, I work remotely and in my own country, I can't do anything because they have vaccine passports and all the rest of it. They've come to Mexico. Yeah. Even a lot of people from the blue states in America, I expected, well, will they go to Florida? Will they go to Texas? A lot of them are here. A lot of them are in Mexico.
Wow, that's interesting.
And they wouldn't have necessarily been able to. I'd say that most of them weren't remote before all this kicked off, and now they're remote. So now, the whole remote working thing has kind of kicked off this geopolitical aspect where people are able to go where they're treated best, essentially. And that's going to be another factor, because now you've got countries, and obviously this really started towards the beginning of the year, you've got countries that are almost competing to remove their mandates. And I'm not sure that would have happened if so many people hadn't been made remote who could just say, okay, well, I'm going to pack up and leave.
Yeah, it's a good point. I do think that's for those of us that are in that position, it is a big win. There's no doubt about it. It's a big win. But I would say that it came at too high a cost. That's the issue for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I wouldn't, if I could turn it, it's been great for me personally, but if I could turn it back and have it go the other way, then I would.
In terms of your situation, was it the whole, is that why you're in Mexico? Was it something that you were contemplating, or were you looking at doing it anyway and it just accelerated your decision?
Yeah, I would say it accelerated it. I mean, Mexico wasn't really the place that was highest on my kind of hit list. I was actually going to go to Canada. That was where I had in mind for where I was going to go. And then...
I nearly went there about 10 years ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, 10 years ago it was probably okay. But now, I mean, God, I can't believe what I've seen out of that country. So yeah, Canada was the place I was going to head. And then in the end, I was like, well, okay, I'm not going to go to Canada. I still can't go into Canada now because I'm unvaccinated. So, Mexico was the most free country at the time. And, I was ready to leave. So I said, okay, I'll go to Mexico. And then, really love the country. So, it's funny because now I would say Mexico is carrying on the corona debacle longer than the UK is, because over here, they're still wearing, like most places, they're still wearing masks, especially in the cities. In the major cities, like, probably the really big ones, most people are wearing masks outside. I would say probably 70 to 80% at least are wearing masks outside. So there's still a lot of that over here. But for some reason, there's this weird dichotomy whereby, they've never had a test to enter the country. They've never had vaccine mandates to enter the country. I think a couple of states tried them and gave up on them very quickly. But overall, it's been very free on this kind of federal level. But on a community level, people are really subscribed to this COVID religion. It's quite strange. What's the situation like in the UK now? Because I haven't been there since December. So
it's sort of remarkably good, actually. I mean, that's the thing that's quite interesting. I mean, and I said about my other half, because I was very pessimistic about a lot of this stuff a year ago. And the fact that so much of it has been lifted, I mean, the sort of, vaccine passports have just completely gone off the agenda, it seems. I mean, I'm sure they'll potentially come back in some shape or form as a digital ID, which is still bubbling under the surface. But, I mean, the only people wearing masks now are the people who are choosing to do so. There's no requirement to wear masks anywhere now. So, and I mean, I travelled up to London on the train a couple of weeks ago, and there were probably less than 5% of the people on the train wearing masks, and it was packed as well. So, they dropped all the mask mandates a couple of months ago, and it was quite bizarre because you get these kind of screeching like lunatics, I call them, really, and particularly on social media. So I take it with a pinch of salt because it doesn't really reflect society as a whole. I appreciate that, but people going on about like we're still in the middle of a deadly pandemic. COVID's not over, and I'm like, well, for those of us that never wore a mask from day one, that have managed to survive the whole thing unscathed. I'm not sure what your point is really, so yeah.
There is one downside to this, though. There is one downside to the fact that now the restrictions have all been taken, is that you can't tell the people who stood against it. It's almost like everyone. It's almost like we could spot the other kind of, people who valued freedom and who hadn't kind of like lost their minds to the fear campaign. You could kind of spot them a bit easier before, and now it's almost like. And the funny thing is, like a lot of people, they're claiming that they never supported lockdowns. Everyone now was an anti-lockdowner. It's I remember when I was in the middle of Trafalgar Square and there was about 1,000 people protesting with bloody Piers Corbyn protesting the lockdowns. I was like, where were all of these other supposed, 70 million British people who now were all anti-lockdowners, etc.? Like, where were they? Everyone is trying to kind of revise history of supporting this stuff because, the honest thing to do would just to be to say, look, I was duped. I believed this thing. I did what I thought was best. But I was wrong. But and I would appreciate that. But my problem is with people who they claim they never supported it, even though they clearly went along with it. They put on the mask, they stayed at home, they locked down, they supported it, they virtue signaled, and it's like, you can't have it both ways. You can't be the virtue signaler back then and then be the virtue signaler now that you realize that you were conned, right?
Yeah, no, I'm totally on the same page as that. I mean, there are people that I will never forgive, for the behaviour, sort of, certainly in the first, year of this whole thing. People that, I mean, it never quite happened to me, but I think there were people that were probably very close to sort of, ringing the police or something. And, when I was like, when they brought the first, ruling, I think we were only in theory allowed to be out for an hour a day. I'm like, you can go fuck yourself, like honestly, I just remember thinking like, is anybody actually taking this seriously? And then you look around and like, oh, actually 90% of the country is taking it seriously. Oh, okay, maybe it's just me then.
Well, I called that house arrest when that all happened. I said we were under house arrest, and everyone was saying, oh, don't be so, dramatic. And I was saying, well, what is the difference? Like, house arrest is literally where you have to stay in your house, aside from maybe an hour a day of exercise. I was like, aside from having a tag on your foot, it's literally the exact same. Like, they can't tag everyone in the country, but the rule is the same. If you go out, you can get arrested by the police. Like, it was house arrest.
Yeah, and I experienced that, at close hand. I went to an event in Stroud, would have been November 2020, and we were out in a nice park, walking around with a few friends, effectively, being harassed by the police.
Oh, okay. Tell us about that.
Well, it was an event in Stroud, so and I really went just to sort of have a look, see what was going on. So it was organised by a sort of a local anti-lockdown group. But it was out in a park. It was literally outside in a park in the open air. And there were only about, 120, 130 people there. And I would say 2/3 of those were sort of middle-aged, housewives. And there must have been at least 50 police, there policing that group of people and hassling people, when they were kind of getting too close, saying, just trying to keep people moving. And they ended up arresting the people who organised it. Quite aggressive sort of policing. I was just horrified, absolutely horrified. That was my real red pill moment. That was, because I'm thinking, this isn't some aggressive like anarchist sort of, anti-capitalist group. This is literally a load of middle-aged housewives, just worried about civil liberties for their families and their kids. And the police were, being unbelievably abrasive in terms of like, literally telling people that, you shouldn't be here. This is an illegal protest. And it wasn't even a protest. It was almost like a spiritual gathering, really.
Yeah, there's quite a few of these events that have a bit of a spiritual edge. Like, people often think that the kind of the freedom movement are, a bunch of, far right, this, that, or the other. And that, everyone's just like angry white men, etc. But like, I go to these things and I'm like, especially some of the protests that I've been to in London, it was like a hippie festival. Yeah. It's like everyone's wearing tie-dye and going around playing steel drums and stuff. I'm like, it's just such a misrepresentation. I mean, and
genuinely, you'll have noticed it as well. Genuinely diverse.
Oh yeah.
In a way that like, things that are supposed to be diverse aren't. So.
Yeah, I mean, so I remember on some of these marches in London, you would have like the Sikhs tended to like be kind of like marching at the front, or sometimes you'd have like Hare Krishnas and stuff, and they'd like singing, and you know, people have got instruments, and then you've got like a bunch of other people who are behind, and there'd be people dancing. You'd have like, there was absolutely it was completely a cross section of society. There was just as many, not just as many black people as white people, obviously, because you know we're a predominantly white country, but like there was you know
a
there was
good
like
mix,
lots
very good mix,
a huge ethnic mix from across the board, and then you would see the reports on. I mean, this was a big red pill for me, was just seeing those reports about the protests. I was just like, our media is completely lost the plot. I mean, it was just such obvious. It was just such obvious misrepresentation. So
because I was at one of those marches, and it was when the delightful Mariana Spring, the BBC's official misinformation correspondent, kind of came on the scene.
Yeah,
and she was tweeting, like live tweeting this march with some of her BBC colleagues, and I screenshot quite a few of them because they were saying, it's you know, about 10,000 or so anti-vaxxers. And I mean, it was like just the most grotesque misrepresentation, you know, I've ever seen, I think, from a supposedly, you know, credible sort of media organization. There must have been at least 300,000 people there that day. You know, it was I think it was the one in April or May last year. So literally, you know, 50 deep, 5 miles across central London, and they're calling it 10,000 people. I mean, you know, I go to sports matches, football and rugby and stuff with 10,000 people. So I know what 10,000 people looks like, and it doesn't look like that, I can tell you. And you know, and just the level of like willful misrepresentation, and sort of almost, I think I got the sense they were literally trying to fabricate their own reality that, you know, kind of corresponded with their sort of political position on things. So, you know, they literally convinced themselves that it was 10,000, you know, right-wing anti-vaxxers, you know, when in reality it was 300,000 people predominantly protesting against civil liberties, or protesting for, civil liberties and personal choice. Even, you know, most of the people I know, you know, they're not even anti-vaxxers. It's like, if you want it, fill your boots, you know, no, don't worry about it. I'm not going to persuade you not to have it. You know, all we'll say is do your research, make a decision that suits you. And, but don't, and for me, you know, again, the big red pill was like the levels of coercion. You know, I don't need to be coerced to look after my health. I do it every day. You know, so when somebody's coercing me to take a product that actually I'm pretty sure I don't need, and I'm making my life almost unlivable to take this particular product, you know, there's no way I'm going to be thinking, yeah, that's good for me. And so it's just bizarre, you know, and it's been staggering. I mean, I'm a bit like you, I suspect, you know, I've spent the last 2 years walking around shaking my head in disbelief, because you just would not believe the things that you see on a daily basis. And particularly with the media. I mean, the media is like just, you know, it's Alice in Wonderland stuff, really, some of the crap they come up with. And yet, but they believe it. They absolutely, entirely invest in the narrative, it seems to me. I think they actually believe their own bullshit, don't they? I mean, this is something that's occurred to me. It's, you know, it's not like Mariana Spring probably actually believes the kind of nonsense she spouts. She probably believes it, you know. It's a form of self-delusion. I mean, it's really funny. It's like I had an ex-girlfriend who I'm quite happy talking about, because she was a total nutter, and you know, she kind of like did a lot of pretty crazy things and came up with some pretty, you know, unbelievable stories, shall we say? Not to go into it too much, but my conclusion off the back of that relationship was like, she actually believed this stuff that she was saying. It wasn't just that she was a great actor. It was like she'd kind of been able to self-delude to the point of these ideas. And it's almost like the media is that kind of psychopath as well. It's like these people who work in the media have self-deluded themselves to these conclusions they come to. And then no matter what they see, they will just apply their bias to it and then report it and put it all over the news. I mean, that's kind of where we're at. I think so, yeah. I mean, ironically, that's where my, you know, the whole Yuri Bezmenov thing came from.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
My Twitter handle.
Yeah, can you go into that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, like Yuri, I don't know if you know much about Yuri Bezmenov. He was basically a KGB information officer in the sort of 60s and 70s, 1960s, 1970s, who defected to Canada, ironically. That's an irony for you, given the state of Canada these days. He produced, there was a series of interviews that he did with a Canadian broadcaster with CBC in the sort of late 70s, early 80s. And I came across him about 10 years ago for the first time. And it was one of those kind of revelatory moments where it's like, oh my God, this guy is literally telling us what's been happening for the last 30 years. Why isn't this on headline news on, BBC One sort of thing? Well, I think we know why it isn't headline news on BBC One, and so he had spent his entire sort of career working for the KGB disinformation service, effectively. So promoting misinformation to the West to basically undermine all of the Western institutions, the education system. And then, so he was actually one of the architects of it. And then he had obviously a sort of a conversion, a Damascene conversion, and defected. And then he went on sort of public, national TV, multiple times trying to warn the West about what was going on, about how the West was literally destroying itself. And he talks about deep programming is the phrase he uses, where, and very much it's media led, where people are just constantly bombarded from all sorts of different channels. This alternative reality that becomes the accepted reality, effectively. And the point he made was that when you get to that point, even if you put, rock solid empirical evidence in front of those people, they'll just ignore it. They literally will just ignore it. They'll just, not accept it. And even to the extent, and it's been my experience where, even things that you experience directly yourself that are contrary to the narrative, people don't process it in the way that you would expect, in that they literally just dismiss it. And it's a very fascinating, if they're all on YouTube. If you just go on YouTube and Google, search for Yuri Bezmenov, there's about 5 or 6 hours worth of interviews. It's highly recommended. And it set me on this path of, sort of, and I think actually it probably helped having seen those videos, because what sort of disinformation and programming looks like. You become sensitized to it. So, and the problem now is I see it everywhere. Pretty much every news broadcast now I find unwatchable, because unless it's like the football scores or something like that, every single bulletin carries an agenda. You can actually see where the editorial team have sort of got together pre the bulletin, and they've basically agreed, right, what is the agenda? What are we promoting in this particular bulletin? And it is so transparent. Once you sort of recognize it, you can't avoid it. So, the horrifying thing is, like, so much of what he spoke about has come true in the last 10 years, really. And this has been going on for sort of 30, 40 years. And you're now seeing the fruits of it, where you've got a population that is so sort of desensitized, almost they can't even see when they're being abused, which is, I view most of this as abuse, frankly. And so very interesting.
Yeah, I've seen a little bit of it, but I need to. I didn't realize it was 6 hours worth, so I ought to go and check it out. I'll put a link to that as well in the show notes.
And that's kind of morphed itself into my Twitter account and this event I'm doing, and I think it's, to some extent, I think I've almost become my Twitter character. It's quite funny. I think my Twitter character is a much more accurate representation of me than my real character these days, because I can say the things I really want to say.
Yeah, it's funny talking to you now and hearing your real voice, because I never know what to expect. There was part of me that was expecting to hear a Russian accent coming out, and and you would be the real Yuri.
not some Cockney geezer.
Yeah. Anyway, I want to talk about this event that you've got coming up, because I know that you're putting together a kind of an event for the free-minded. So, yeah, what's it about?
Yeah, essentially that. Yeah, it was really, this was my sort of as I said earlier on, I'm there's only so much analysis you can do. You need to start thinking about, right, what the hell are we going to do about it? And this was my sort of first contribution to it, really. So it started out, the idea was just to have a social event, really, just to gather a few sort of like-minded people together. I mean, the thing that struck me, I've been very lucky. I've got a really good network locally, so I've never felt isolated or sort of, although we don't agree on all of it, I've not fallen out with my family, so
that's good.
I've not had the sort of issues, but, I know lots of people that have almost, become entirely isolated, their partners and family have almost disowned them. A good friend of mine, has been effectively disowned by her family. Her daughter won't speak to her. She won't let her see her grandchildren. It's absolutely horrifying, really. And
that is so sad.
So this was sort of my response to trying to kind of, bring people together, and it kind of got a bit out of hand, really, because then I thought, well, actually, let's try and do something a bit more interesting. Let's try and make it useful for people. So I put a few calls out to different people that I knew and got some good responses. And so, the idea was really to sort of, on a sort of personal level, try and give people a few tools that they can adopt in terms of being more resilient on a personal basis.
Yeah.
I'm a very resilient person, but it's through a sort of a lifetime of hard knocks, and but not everybody is. And some people, need some help to become more resilient, and particularly if you've had a tough time in the last 2 years. Some people are pretty beaten up, actually. And then I had some amazing responses, actually, people that kind of came forward and said, we really like the idea of this. Can we get involved? And so I've had some amazing speakers have stepped forward to say, well, I'll come and do a bit on, sort of personal health, how you can keep, some of the things you can do to look after your health so that you basically avoid, as much as you can, any contact with the health service, which is ironic. And then another guy is going to do a presentation on sort of, who's actually a behavioral psychologist. So he's going to do a presentation on basically how to recognize when you're being manipulated and nudged.
Oh, wow.
And then I've got a couple of people, we're just going to do like a panel conversation about, what next? What do we do? What do we do collectively to kind of try and, get through, build institutions or whatever. So not quite sure how that bit's going to go, really, because I think we're all struggling a bit in terms of what the options are. But
so where's it taking place?
It's in Kenilworth in the Midlands, so near Birmingham.
And have you like rented out a hotel or some kind of event space?
Yeah, so we've got a big conference suite at it's the Holiday Inn in Kenilworth. So we've got a conference suite, fit about 120 people in there just. So at the moment I've got about 100 going, so I've got room for about another 20 or so. So if anyone's listening to your podcast and they want to come along, follow my Twitter account and you can find the link on there to the booking link. So yeah, hopefully, and it's quite interesting actually, because there's quite a few people coming that I would guess probably half the people there, have a network on Twitter, but they've never met in real life.
Yeah.
So for a lot of the people, this will be the first time they've met some of their sort of good Twitter friends, as it were, in real life. So that should be fun. And then, hopefully there'll be a few of us will make some sort of, slightly more, I suppose, productive contacts so that we can start doing things on a more sort of, not professional level, but, looking at, certainly there'll be people there from the Freedom Alliance. So that'll be a chance for them to promote the Freedom Alliance, in terms of getting people interested in that and engaged in that, as a potential political option. And then, so we'll see where it goes, really. And then, but it's quite funny. So on the back of this, it's like, I think I've accepted now that I've kind of created brand Yuri Bezmenov as a sort of a counterculture brand. Yeah, that's quite.
It's great. I like the new profile picture. It looks awesome.
Right. Yeah. That was one of the guys that has stepped up to help. basically, who's
Oh,
a
nice.
graphic designer, said, I'll knock you up some graphics. And he did that just off the cuff for me. So, so it's been it's been very life affirming, actually. It's been really, really fantastically positive experience I've done a few things in the past like this where I used to do a bit of like promoting bands and things.
Yeah.
And if you've ever done a gig, it's a terrifying experience, trust me, because first of all, you book the venue and you book the band. And first, you hope the band turns up for one thing, because I've had a few near misses on that. And then you just spend the next couple of months fretting about whether you're going to sell any tickets or not. And people are so flaky, I find as well, the number of people who say, yeah, sounds fantastic, I would love to come. And then, when it comes to spending 10 quid on a ticket, even just to go to see a band, they find 101 excuses why they can't go. And
right.
And this is like, it's not cheap. It's 85 quid a ticket, which, it just covers the cost of the venue and because it includes dinner as well. So there's a dinner involved and a disco and a DJ afterwards. So, it's probably going to end up costing me a few quid, which is fine because I wasn't, I was just doing it for fun really. And, but yeah, so I've sold 80 tickets already. So there's actually only 20 tickets left to sell at the moment.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, it sounds like you'll end up booking it out. So that's great. Yeah, it's just awesome.
Yeah.
The people are doing stuff like this. I mean, so many people have stepped up to the plate in this community. I think of actually off the back of everything we've seen, just doing things, whether it's events or some kind of citizen journalism or whatever it is. Like so many people have really kind of stepped up to the plate, and I think that at the end of the day, it's like you can either kind of get buried by all this stuff or you can kind of grow through it. And I think that we're really starting to see people kind of rise up and, self-actualize in a way. And, I think this event is just another example of some great stuff that the community is doing. So congrats.
It's interesting. Yeah. One of the I'm not going to do any speeches or anything, but I am going to do like a quick 5-minute intro. And one of the things I shall be saying to people is that, look, the only reason this is happening is because I just decided to do it. It was as simple as that. I just thought, you know what, I'm going to do it. And that's the sort of message, is that you just got to go and do stuff. If you want to make things happen, you just got to go and make it happen. Because one of the things I've said right the way through this, there are no white knights. There's nobody going to ride in and rescue us, because I don't think, we're the good guys. The good guys aren't the ones running the show. We're going to have to find a way of removing them and putting some good people in their place.
Let's leave it there. Thanks so much, Yuri.
No problem.